The Alabama Booksmith presents Author Spotlight. Because every book in our store is signed, our wall of fame displays a breathtaking array of writers and signatures. Close-up shots reveal giants of literature, acclaimed historians, stars of stage and screen, our nation's leaders, famous sports heroes, and thousands of other esteemed authors. Today's Wall of Fame guest is Jen Phillips, who will discuss her new book, Family Law. And here is Jen Phillips with our host, Jake Reese.
Welcome, Jen Phillips, and welcome to our audience. You are in for a treat as this award-winning author gives us a sneak preview of her incredible new book, Family Law. We're just so glad to have you here, Jen Phillips, and looking forward to talking about family law. And we think it's gripping and poignant, suspenseful, and, if we may, clever funny.
Well, thank you.
All rolled into one. And although the story starts in 1979, long before the Me Too movement or so much that's going on, it's really technically spot on for today. I have a fist full of questions, and the first one is, why did you start in 1979?
Well, my last book was about motherhood, and in some ways this is also about motherhood, although the mothers we choose instead of the mothers we're born to. I found the 70s a really interesting time, particularly because I knew I wanted to write about the women who shape us, the people who shape us. You know, maybe, I'm sure there are people out there who grew into exactly the person that their parents raised them to be. For most of us, I think, there is probably some gap between the world we were raised in and the person we became. And I find that gap interesting. How do you choose the self you become? And the 70s, particularly for women, for girls, were an interesting time. You had the ERA sort of still floating around. This book deals with Lucia, a lawyer at a time when a woman in the courtroom was still really rare, when you might have one or two women in a law school class. And so I liked that.
Not a lot of women in juries.
Right, still reasonably rare. No women judges, or that was in Alabama, that was extremely rare. And so I like that time of when we were on the cusp of something. The old traditions were starting to shift. It's still a world where there are a lot of little boxes for men and women, black and white, right and wrong, but those boxes are not as stable as they used to be. And so I thought that time period worked really well, both for a woman, a grown woman who was still working out who she was going to become, and in some ways even more so for a teenage girl who's looking around trying to figure out, who am I going to be? Which
brings us to the terrific mechanism you use in alternating voices, the alternating narrator, Lucia and Rachel. Tell our audience about Lucia.
So Lucia is a lawyer in her early 30s, married, happy, carving out a place for herself in Montgomery. And again, at a time when there are not many women lawyers, she is also in a specialty of law that is really coming into its own, family law, handling custody, divorces, the ways families are shaped. So she comes from a much more traditional background. She's close to her parents. In some ways, she's very connected to her background, but she's also carving out this space for herself that to her feels like there are no precedents around her, that she is figuring it out as she goes along. She's a lot of fun to write. She has a lot of joy and a tremendous amount of determination, and
she's a
lot of tough.
And she's tough.
She's very hard to shake. She really dislikes the notion of fear, which comes to, and in some ways the book plays a lot with that, with the idea of what do you do with fear? What do you do when there's something terrifying out there? How do you handle that? And so, yes, Lucia is very determined that fear is not something that's going to drive her.
And now, share with us, I love Rachel. Share with us who Rachel is.
So Rachel is a 16-year-old. I grew up in Montgomery as well, and I grew up in a reasonably traditional household surrounded by what felt like other traditional households. And so although Rachel's family is not my family, the world she grows up in is very familiar to me. Montgomery at that time period is familiar, but her sense of trying to make sense of who she's supposed to grow into when there have been so many sort of lines drawn and bars set for what girls should do, what makes a good girl, what's the appropriate way for a girl to behave. She is starting to chafe at all those rules. She is also, I think, a very funny teenager who has learned the best way to deal with things sometimes is to joke about it, but underneath that, her home situation is not really all that funny. But when she meets Lucia, she suddenly sees there's some other paths out there. That the ways that women and her family have acted, the choices they've made, are not the only choices. Like I said, I find that tension really fun to write, of when you're still deciding who you're going to be and trying to make it come together.
I think Rachel is going to capture readers' hearts. She's
I hope so.
She's a great character, great poem. We've followed your career and since the first award-winning book, and I know for a fact that you didn't go to law school.
Thank goodness.
But this darn book is so great in the technicalities of law and legal, and will you share how in the world you gained this incredible insight? Where did all this technical stuff come from?
Well, I certainly did some book research, but mostly, maybe more than a decade ago, I was doing an article for a local paper on a local lawyer, Judy Crittenden, and who I'd heard was very smart and very tough and scary. And I sat down to interview her, and I found her delightful and charming and funny, and that sort of differential, I guess, between what I'd heard and what I found interesting, and really liked her, just found her interesting. And so a decade later, maybe, as I was starting to think about this book and what I wanted to tackle, I called her up and said, can I just talk to you about your career? Can you just tell me some stories? And it turned out she had quite a lot of stories. Lucia in the book is not Judy, but her career, the world of law for a woman at that time is very much from Judy. And again, I had other sources as well, but she really helped to flesh out what it was like to be a lawyer in your 30s when you were the only woman lawyer. And I think there are a lot of details in the book that if she hadn't said them, I would never have made them up, because I would never believe that a judge or another lawyer could say such a thing to you. But the environment of what was okay to say and do, for me, I think especially at a time when I realized we're not talking about the 1800s. We're talking about a time I was alive, that I was sitting on shag carpet playing with strawberry shortcake. And that at the same time, there's this huge discrepancy between what we think of as a professional life for a woman now and what was happening just a few decades ago. So Judy was incredibly helpful and in really making that time period feel much more textured, and checking the court scenes for me. And she is an excellent source in every way for details and stories and humor. I should say, any mistakes are definitely mine.
Well, I believe your readers are going to have their eyes. Readers who were not alert and aware of what was going on in the late 1970s and early 80s in the courtrooms are going to wondered, did that really happen? And of course, those of us long in the tooth know, heck yeah, and much more so.
Right, right.
In trying to discern and read very carefully between the lines, there were several cases in the book that I went back and reread, and I wondered and been looking forward to asking you which ones came from the fertile author's mind and which ones might have a little fact base. When Rachel was working off her community service, there was a potential scary situation that, again, I think many readers might identify with. Was that made up, or was there some fact-based?
That's funny that that's the one you picked. And I will again say, a lot of this is made up. You happen to have picked one that isn't. I got a speeding ticket in a school zone when I was 16, and my punishment was 2 Saturdays of community service. Actually at the Montgomery Zoo, but I could not write about a zoo again because the last book was at the zoo. And yeah, the person that they put me with was I was supposed to clean the girls' bathrooms, and he was supposed to clean the boys' bathrooms, and he was there for the same reasons that are disturbing and predatory, that the same reasons that the character in the book is. So no, it was I've been wanting to do something with that for years, but some of the specifics are changed, but the basic setup there, I do not think perhaps that Montgomery County was maybe paying attention to why they might not put sex offenders at the zoo working with teenagers. But in my own case, nothing happened, but no, it was a bizarre setup to spend a couple of Saturdays.
Well, for the audience, full disclosure, I did not know that when I asked the question.
He picked really well.
But well, it was so beautifully written and so true to life that again, I believe when readers get to that passage, that's one I read again, and it's so realistic, and now I see why it was so realistic.
It stuck with me.
It evidently did. Surely the shooting into Lucia's house was from your mind.
No, all the summaries are so I don't know that I want to get. I don't know that I want to get into the details too much, but the main.
But we don't want to give away any.
I don't want to give it right. I don't want to give away anything. But the main the main turning point of the book, which is violent, is based on something really similar that happened to Judy. It's very close to what actually happened. People go crazy during divorces. I do just think it is a field of law where I think you maybe get a little more craziness than the average lawyer. But yes, the main event in the book is based on something that really happened.
It's amazing.
Now, what spins off out of there and who did it and the specifics, that's all changed. But there was a gun involved at one point.
Wow. Well, it's family law is an entertaining read, but we believe it will provoke deep thoughts long after the last pages turn.
Oh, thank you, Jay.
It did just an incredible job, and we think it's going to be an important book for audience of all genders. Some may be more affected than others. What residue would you hope remains in your readers' minds when they've turned the last page?
In some ways, I guess the answer is always the same, that you hope they know too. You can't really hope for world-changing, life-changing pages necessarily, but you hope that these two characters stick in their minds, that you learn a little something about what it's like to be them. And, I think the idea of, living in tidy boxes can be very comforting, the notion that life is made up of these very neat boxes and we should stay inside the lines. I hope maybe it also brings up questions of whether life is really like that. I think both characters in the book realize the boxes are a fiction. There are no tidy lines. Life is messy and complicated, and that you start from there, and then you move on, and that's when you can really start to grow and change and carve out a real life.
Well, I think you're going to be very successful in that hope. But we know that Kirkus and NPR and Today and USA Today, many of the nation's leading newspapers have heaped great praise upon you and your work. It's your books have sold in 29 countries. That's
It's crazy.
Pretty impressive. We're so appreciative of your taking time to come in and talk about this great book. Congratulations. It's
thank you.
Wonderful, powerful
And it
book.
is always a pleasure to be here at the Booksmith. Always fun.
Well, and those watching, you may purchase signed first editions of Family Law at alabamabooksmith.com.